first of all, I wanted to bring up the mention of the 2 microphones. We are really looking forward to your thoughts and questions, as my experience at Republica is that most of you in the room are as much experts as we on the stage. So really, please feel free to share your thoughts afterwards. Now I will do a short introduction. And what's funny is I had lots of discussion over the last days on the term poverty porn, but seeing the room as full as it is, it shows that the title did work. Using maybe the same technique that we are criticizing, so that could be a criticism at that point for me, because I came up with the title, but I was eager to see if it would work or not. What we are going to talk about is the commercialization of suffering, which is a very important topic, and I'm very happy to have 2 wonderful journalists and experts sitting next to me. I'm going to start with our international guests, Isabel, who is working for the New Humanitarian, a humanitarian news organization, as the title says, and she's responsible for audience development there, but also a journalist. Isabel, do you want to say a few more words to yourself? I always like if people introduce themselves.
Yes, hello everyone. Love to see the room packed. This is really encouraging. So, Isabel Rugol. I work at the New Humanitarian. It's a newsroom, nonprofit newsroom, dedicated to covering humanitarian crises. Our mission is to improve humanitarian response and ideally humanitarian prevention of crises through quality journalism. So hoping that information and good storytelling can actually help kind of change the facts on the ground and inform people working in the aid sector, working on crises to improve the way that they work, essentially. And my own background is as a journalist, writer, podcaster, different things in different countries.
Thank you so much. On my other side, I have Celia, which I had the pleasure of working with before at the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin. Celia is a journalist for Zeit Online, so you might have read articles of her. And she also is, I hope I'm right, editor-in-chief of Rosamag, a fantastic online magazine for on issues relating to Black women. I wouldn't say for Black women, because I love to read it.
Yeah, hi. My name is Celia Pabe. I'm a journalist, as you already mentioned, working for Zeit Online and various print magazines and online magazines. And I have my own online magazine called Rosamag for Black women in Germany and allies as well. And I usually cover topics surrounding feminism, racism, and colonial continuities. And a lot of topics concerning the African continent as well.
It was really, I can only recommend it because I'm in love with the articles. So we are talking about the commercialization of suffering, which is a rather, no, sorry, I'm wrong. I should introduce myself as well. I'm very sorry. I always tend to forget that. My name is Anna Ramsko-Glavit. I have the absolute pleasure to be the director of the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin, which takes place every year in autumn. And we use the festival to show documentaries from all over the world touching upon human rights and social issues. And we also offer a professional platform for exchange of thoughts and workshops. And the next festival is in October this year. You're very welcome. So, and now we are going to start diving deep into the topic. When I was reading on the issue and when I was researching for this talk, I thought that there is a very fine line between voyeurism and reporting about suffering, which is necessary so that we make people aware of situations elsewhere. I was wondering what's your thought about this fine line and where you think that voyeurism starts and reporting ends. And then I will continue with the second part of the question. Who wants to start?
It's me, yeah. Where does voyeurism start? I feel like it starts when I start dehumanizing the other person, when it's not about actually seeing eye to eye and be like, okay, I'm reporting, I'm covering your story, your misery, your whatever, but it's more like, okay, this is happening to your kind of people. Of course, this is happening to your side of the world, maybe, or yeah, I feel like this is where voyeurism starts.
Would you agree on that?
Yes, similarly. I think there's a very fine line. I mean, essentially, the work of journalism and of news is to show what's happening in other people's lives. And in that sense, you know, there's always an element of voyeurism, of curiosity about how other people live. I think, yes, it becomes a way to avoid. I don't, you know, the line. It's kind of like you see it when you've crossed it, but it's hard to define. But I think a way to avoid crossing it is to work with the subjects of your stories in partnership, and to kind of get rid of that hierarchy of I'm looking at you and I'm telling your story, and you don't get to have a say in it or in really on how it's portrayed and how you're perceived. If it becomes a collaboration, which, I mean, we can talk about that, is also fraught when you're an independent journalist of how that cooperation can really happen. That's where you kind of avoid the voyeurism, and you're able to start telling a whole story of a person rather than just pointing at, you know, one bit of their experience.
Yeah, and I feel like in journalism, voyeurism starts very, to say it starts early, I just forgot my thought, I'm so sorry. That was interesting.
But I have a question for you, no worries, maybe then the thought comes up. You said for you, voyeurism is when someone is reporting about a group or a person and saying, that's them. That's their problem, that's their issue. And while researching, and also on a panel at Berlinale where it was about diversity in reporting and in film, we talked a lot about, and I read a lot about the self-perception of people. And so maybe a question, how do you think that the reporting in media has an effect on the the perception of the people themselves?
Okay, I think I'd like to give an example for maybe, for Africans, basically, in a broader sense. So many stories that people hear about Africa are stories of poverty, stories of crisis, stories of inhumane treatment of people, just very, very terrible and horrible stories. These are the only stories that most people hear about Africans in general. Many, many people in Germany, for example, don't know any person of African descent. They never meet them. They never get to see them anywhere. When they first meet a person who is black, it doesn't even have to be an African. They first meet a person who's black. The first thought they will have is all of these images that had been popping up around them all of their lives. So they will project their idea of Africa onto that black person. The black person themselves might do the same as well. If a black person grows up in Germany and the only thing they read about when it comes to Africa and they are of African descent is stories about poverty, terrible stories, then they might start believing that about themselves as well. Okay, black people are a certain way, I have to behave a certain way to not be like these Africans over there. So somehow it starts with an image about a certain group of people and it ends with an individual case of a person getting mistreated, getting discriminated against, or worse.
I'm going to touch upon the point of how the perception of society in a bit, but the New Humanitarian is a newsroom for reporting on humanitarian issues. Humanitarian issues are often not very positive. They are often related to suffering, to poverty, to wars. I know that you're trying to avoid pitfalls of so-called poverty porn or other misrepresentation of people. What's the ways you try to do that?
Yes. So I should preface this by saying that we don't by any means have all the answers. It's just something we're thinking about a lot as an organization. I'm also quite new in the organization, so apologies in advance to my colleagues who might be listening, but I will try this. I think, as you pointed out, we write about humanitarian crises. It's a very specific beat. It's a tiny part of what is happening in the places that we cover. And in fact, we're thinking more and more about how we cover humanitarian crises, not just in the global south. The majority of our stories in the global south, but when you cover, the crises of forced displacement and migration tragedies that are happening in the Mediterranean or in the Channel, those are European issues. That's a European humanitarian crisis. It's not the crisis of where the migrants come from. It's our crisis. But there are different ways that you can do that. One of the ways, as I mentioned earlier, is to try and tell full stories about people, full stories about people and full stories about countries. So even though we cover humanitarian crises, we try to cover countries long before they show up in the mainstream so-called media, and we try to stay a lot longer than when people have moved on. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Sudan right now, a large majority of our colleagues in media have kind of already moved on, and we're covering it a lot. And by the way, the other preamble that I wanted to share is this isn't a conversation about distributing gold stars and and blame. I think we're all trying in different ways and within our abilities to address these issues. But so, as I said, one way is to try and tell full stories of countries and of people. So an example that I like to use is we had this investigation last year about the use of rape as a weapon of war in Haiti. The situation in Haiti right now is just horrendous. I mean, I've read a lot of terrible, horrific stories, and I think those from Haiti are some of the worst right now. And by the way, when we talk about Haiti, we always make it a point to acknowledge colonial continuities and the reasons why what's happening in Haiti right now is in large part, not only but significantly because of my country, France. So, we have to acknowledge that. But we did a story about our freelancer in Haiti and our investigations editor, Paisley Dodds, did a story on rape as a weapon of war in Haiti. And we have a couple in this story, Marguerite and Baptiste. They're fake names. We had to change them for their protection, but Baptiste was actually murdered. Marguerite was raped in a horrible way. And that could be the only thing that you say about them. But actually, the story starts with how they fell in love in high school at a church retreat. And they started a family, and they had 6 children, and they rented a small house in Cité Soleil. It's a couple paragraphs in the story. I actually wish there was more of it. But if you're able to tell a full story of someone, and not just the worst thing that's ever happened to them, they just become a person and not just an illustration of your point as a writer. And that creates, hopefully, empathy or helps people relate because you're looking at a whole person and not just at a cliche of what human suffering looks like. Because, in the midst of war, in the midst of the worst tragedies on earth, people fall in love, people raise children, people go grocery shopping, life continues to happen, and it's just trying to picture all of that. There are many other things, but I'll pass the mic.
Before I go to the commercialization part of the question, maybe for Celia, if we talk about we touch upon how it affects the individual, what's out there reported, but as a society, we had that in our pre-talk. We touched upon it a little bit, and I would like to go deeper. If we see someone represented in a specific way in TV or in feature films, and then reads the relating newspaper article, it shapes their perception. As a journalist, and maybe that's a tricky question, but as a journalist, how do you try to not fall in these pitfalls of stereotypes?
Of stereotypes. It depends on the story, I guess. I mean, some stereotypes about certain parts of the world, there's some truth to them. And as you just mentioned, Isabel, it's all about telling the whole story, not just one part of it. I'm not omitting any bad parts ever. If there's poverty as a part of a story of a person, I will definitely mention it. It just can't be the only part. So it's basically, I mean, just see the person, never just one issue.
Like that. When I'm talking to filmmakers, news organizations, or even charities, often what comes up if we are talking about the way we are framing things, the main argument is it works. And I know that as a film programmer myself, it's a really hard reality for me sometimes. People love to see really hard documentaries about the worst places in the world. Sometimes I can be sure those are sold out, which makes me thinking what that means for organizations or even news outlets, how much you have to fall in that line, and how you can creatively combat that and still get your links, your money, your donations, which you effectively need to work.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is you're hitting the nail on the head. I think there's always going to be a fundamental kind of conflict, or you know, incentives are pulling in different directions. On the one hand, you know, you want to tell the full human stories with the nuance and, you know, all of what we just described. And then, you know, we live in the attention economy where the most shocking thing, the most, you know, in-your-face thing is going to drive attention. And you want to drive attention for the best of intentions, which is that you want people to know about this crisis. You know, if you're a nonprofit that's using storytelling, maybe you want to attract donations, you want to attract, you know, attention to crises that are often overlooked and neglected. So, and you want attention because you're hoping that attention leads to impact. It's actually something we're thinking about a lot in our audience work at the New Humanitarian, in the editorial work, which is when we, you know, kind of think about a story in the ideation process. It's what is the impact that we want the story to have, and you know, we're journalists, we're not activists, but we want the journalism to be used to, you know, make a difference. So what is the impact we want the story to have? And what is the audience that we need to reach in order for the story to have that impact? So you kind of think, you know, as you're devising the story, and then certainly as you're distributing it once it's published, who does this need to get to have impact? And it's not necessarily the broadest audience. It can be just kind of targeted to the right audience. I mean, we work with different audiences. One is a mainstream audience, but actually our core audience is the aid sector and the humanitarian sector. And so because of their profession, you know, they're supposed to already care about these things, so you don't necessarily need to do as much of the work of like going and grabbing their, you know, their heartstrings. That said, you know, a perfect example that we had recently, one of our recent stories that traveled the furthest, and traveled because, and I should say this to this audience, all of our content is published under Creative Commons, and you're welcome to click the republish link on any of our stories on our website, grab the full HTML, and publish it on your own websites if you're a news publisher, if you're a nonprofit, if you work in those sectors, because we just want the stories to travel. We're not greedy with our copyright. So that's my announcement. But one of those stories that traveled really well, it was translated in Spanish in El País, it was published in The Telegraph in the UK, was a story about the famine in Somalia at the moment. And it traveled really well, I'm sure partly because it had a really grabby headline, kind of like this panel with the poverty porn. It was a story in Somalia, and one of the very telling images that we have in the story, and that was in the headline, is mothers poisoning their own children, making them eat soap so they'll get sick, so they'll go to the hospital, because in the hospital they'll be fed. So obviously the kids, they're poisoning them just enough for the kids to be ill, so that they can be admitted to hospital where they will be fed. I mean, imagine the just absolute gut-wrenching choice that a mother would make to do that to their own children. And obviously that's a very graphic image of human suffering. And, you know, we go back to, is that the right story to tell? Is that fair to tell? Are we, you know, perpetuating some cliche? I mean, it's true, it's happening. Are we using it for the cheap clicks? Are we? I don't think we are. But it's, you know, those are, I think, conversations that you have with every story. And in the end, sorry, just to finish that point, I think it comes down to agency and transparency in our work, you know, in the way that you interact with the people who are generous enough to share their story, and do they want that story told about them, and if so, are they fully aware of how that story will be used, and if they tell us this is what's happening in our town, please tell the world. That's our job, to tell the world, right?
Very true. But with all you're talking about, I think that's very true for the New Humanitarian. As you're a non-profit organization, you are not necessarily depending on people buying for the content you're creating. Is that correct?
We still want readers, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
So,
yeah, it's a different business model, but in the end, you want readers,
Yeah.
and you want donors, and you want to, you know, continue the organization. So, and certainly we don't let that determine what we do in our journalism, but the incentives are there, of course.
Because I was trying to ask, I was wondering, Celia, if you can relate to what Isabel was just saying, that you can agree, and if, I mean, you're writing for not non-profit paper, so for-profit paper. If you see different challenges there, I mean, Zeit Online is obviously one of the very responsible news outlets, I would say, and serious ones. Of course, but my perception, maybe
Yeah,
I'm
we are
wrong.
definitely.
Not making.
Don't get her in trouble. Come on.
No, I'm not.
What do you mean? No, I love my job. Thank you.
But do you see like different challenges, and how much pace how much do you have to think about the audience who reads?
I am very lucky because I work for a department at Zeit Online that is usually covering topics concerning racism, feminism, and colonial continuities. So basically, I am where I'm supposed to be at in my work. So I can cover anything that I want to cover. It's funny because I did a bigger story on white saviorism. So the idea of young volunteers, white volunteers going to Africa, South America, wherever, Asia, to teach people things that they haven't learned themselves yet. And that was one of my most, I think it was one of my most successful articles. So people...
That's also the reason why you're sitting here today.
This is why I was invited.
I'm sorry. Also the rest of your work, but during my research, I came across this article and it was like,
Yeah.
interesting.
So in that sense, it did work. Like demystifying this whole volunteering abroad when you're 18 and you just want to learn something about the world. It worked. People want to read this because they do want to read the truth about something they thought was something super helpful for the whole world, all of their lives. When I cover crises in general, so I just did a story on Uganda, for example, then people are not that intrigued. That is very true. But that's an issue when it comes to African topics in general. The average German reader, so far, does not read many things about Africa in general. And if they do read something, then they will go for the crisis story. But they just, in general, don't read many things about Africa.
I mean, that's going to be a real huge question, and I don't just want to dump it on you. You won't have the final answer, but have you ideas on how we can change that? Like raise general awareness?
Isabel mentioned it earlier, but it's about empathy. It's about understanding people on a human level. Most Germans are probably not that interested in African stories because they can't relate to most Africans. And I told you the story earlier. I studied in Kenya in 2019, and I went there with a group of white Germans, and after a week, one of my colleagues, he told me, "Hey Celia, I was playing PlayStation with my Kenyan host brother the whole night, and I could see in his eyes that this was the first time he realized, okay, this is the same, he's the same guy as me. We're the same age, 23, we're both studying, we both like PlayStation, we both like this." As you mentioned, from now on, he will never look at Kenyans or Africans in the same way again. He will never be like, okay, these are human beings beneath me maybe or different from me. He won't other them anymore, but he will be like, okay, this is a person, this is my friend. And I feel like if people in general could exchange, if there was a bigger exchange between people from, different cultures always sounds very, but I'm saying people need to get in touch with each other and see their humanity. And this is when they will start wanting to read other stories as well.
Yeah, and this is where, just taking off my new humanitarian hat for a second, my other soapbox is I'm a big proponent of youth exchanges. I was an exchange student when I was in high school, and if it were up to me, every single teenager in the world would do that, because once you've lived in another culture, in a host family, you've gone to school, and you've just shared daily life rather than just the stuff that's in the news, you just develop an understanding of, just kind of our shared humanity, which I don't think news is the place to do that, because in essence, I mean, we have conversations about, okay, we shouldn't just write about all the horrible things happening in the world, and there should be, there's different ways, like positive news, constructive news, solutions, journalism. There's a lot of different words around like how we can talk about more than just the problems, but fundamentally, news is about a lot of things going wrong in the world, and it's not about Kenyans playing PlayStation in the evening. And so to create that empathy and to fight those stereotypes, I think pop culture and entertainment has much more power than news. Like Afrobeats explosion right now, Nigerian rom-coms on Netflix, Black Panther showing, just very different picture of Africa, Korean soaps all over the place right now. Like those things build much more empathy than news ever can.
But
yes,
what I've seen.
Please disagree, please.
What I've seen in newspapers, not being from the news business, being from the documentary, coming from the documentary side, but what I've seen in news is that lifestyle, even in serious newspapers, work really well. For example, going to an architect's home, looking around, taking photos, this kind of series. Mainly every serious newspaper has stuff like that, like lifestyle components. So if we try to relate to other people from other places of the world, living same as we do, but supposedly from the perception of many differently, wouldn't that a point where one could say changing the perception, making them interested in other people's lives, that would be like not just show the white famous architect in New York, but also like show the very same approach, for example, Kenyan architect who is doing great work there. Because I've actually never read an article about a Kenyan architect. I just realized.
So far. Yeah, definitely. Like, definitely you should, when you're doing magazine journalism, the big stories should be about people from different continents, different countries. I think news coverage is what you meant, more or less, like the news, which is a bit harder to make nice, basically, yeah. Right? You were talking about news coverage.
Yeah, yes. Okay. Yes, and also, I don't know, we talk a lot about like should and...
Could. I'm Austrian. We use a lot of should, could.
Yeah. I think, well, it's just, I don't really, I don't know if I believe in kind of like working against the grain of what audiences want or telling our audiences like, hey, you should care about this, like, let us give you your broccoli, you know, or I think there is, but fundamentally, you're going to care more about things that are happening in your immediate neighborhood, in your, like, the things that have a direct impact on your lives, than you're going to care about something happening 4,000 miles away, you know, wherever you are in the world.
But sorry,
I can tell you when I was living in Cambodia, I don't think Cambodians cared that much about what was going on in Europe.
Of course, but isn't it also...
But they do, because power, right?
I was like, well, and because, I mean, the internet. I feel like every person, a young person I met, I was in Ghana recently, for example, they knew about pop culture all over the world.
Yeah, pop culture. But I mean, like news, politics.
But then most people don't know about politics in their own countries.
Sorry?
Most people don't know about politics in their own countries.
Yeah.
I mean...
And isn't it also what we are... Two questions. Isn't it what we are used to? We are used to bad headlines, and I had Anne Heinrichs, I don't know if any in the audience know her, she's the founder of the Bonn Institute on Constructive Journalism, on a panel at the festival 2 years ago, and she basically said, we are losing people in the news exactly because of that kind of reporting, because of stereotyping, because of only highlighting what's bad in the news, because of being absolutely destructive and like giving people basically no hope. So they stop reading the news. I don't know if you can relate to that constructive journalism might be, because I'm looking for solutions, of course.
I mean, in general, I do believe a bit in teaching your audience, a bit, because there's so many biases and so many things that people are taught that they have no idea about. But I do get the whole of not pushing this upon people, because then they're just like, nah, I don't want it. In general, yeah, I'm just gonna let you keep going.
Yeah, sorry, the question was around constructive
journalism.
I know it is an approach that our newsroom takes. Both a constructive approach and a decolonialized approach. So for every story, I know the editors have kind of a series of, it's literally like a form at the top of the draft of a story, answering a number of questions to make sure that we kind of hit these points in the story. So, you know, is there kind of a forward-looking angle? And it doesn't mean like, again, we write about horrible things happening in the world, so it doesn't mean like every story is going to end up on a chipper, you know. No, it's just like, are we giving a sense of, you know, what the way out of this situation might be, not solutions, because like those are very, very complex problems, and we're not going to, you know, prescribe, but, you know, where is the conversation around where those solutions might be? And then the decolonialized angle is things like, you know, is the story acknowledging colonial continuities that are leading to this situation? Are we also, that's something we didn't touch on, but we always work with local contributors, local journalists, rather than parachuting in. There's a big way of fighting stereotypes, right? If you just show up in a country for the first time, you're only gonna see stereotypes. Everything's gonna be like, whoa, I didn't know this, and you're just gonna be, it takes familiarity with the place to be able to see beyond the stereotypes and to be able to relate kind of the little everyday things. So we work with local contributors, writers, photographers, illustrators, artists who have that knowledge. And we also make it a point to interview local experts. Like, you don't need to interview a professor at Oxford about something going on, in Ghana. There are great universities in Ghana with plenty of professors who know this. And so that's, one of the things that we also make a point of in our journalism.
Are you aware of similar guidelines in for-profit newsrooms, and do you think that would help?
I am not allowed to talk about anything like that. What?
But
I think in general that's a very great approach. That is a very great approach, and it's very important. Yeah.
Okay, we leave it like that.
We're not the only ones doing that, and we don't pretend to have the absolute solutions. It's a conversation that's happening, I think, in the industry. Is it happening fast enough? Is it spread enough? Ooh, God, no. But it's certainly something we're not the only ones doing.
Then again, I'm lucky that I'm working for a very nice department, which they are letting me do many things, basically. And when it comes to choosing the experts that I work with from the African continent, is something happening there as well. I do always find people on the ground to speak to, basically, whenever anything happens. And that's something that is in general, that is something that is done at Set Online in general.
Sorry, if I may just continue on that. The elephant in the room is that the news industry is incredibly not diverse. And so, you're only going to, as long as you only get the same kinds of storytellers, you're only going to get the same kinds of stories.
And I think that's true for many parts of storytelling, at least the visible ones. I wouldn't say the documentary scene, for example, is not diverse, but the money goes, but where the money goes is not diverse. I would say that's the problem. Not that the people who are out there, who would be willing to tell the story, are not diverse enough, but the way we spread the money is very not diverse. Very devastating, sorry. In films in general, I just looked at the new publishing number, at the new numbers of diversity of film spendings in Germany. Interesting numbers. I can encourage anyone to look at them. Before we open to the audience, I come from the constructive side. So, the obvious thing is there's lots of headlines out there who put the suffering of people in the focus in order to gain clicks, and who exploit stories. That's just out there, maybe not in the newsrooms you're working for, but in general. What would be, in your personal opinion, and I know that's a big question, a hook or a starting point to change that?
The clickbaity titles, you mean?
Or the poverty born in news. In general. Big question.
Pick one.
Pick one. Just one thought, one tiny thing, or you're saying...
How to get rid of poverty porn is probably getting rid of systemic racism worldwide.
Oh yeah, so a small thing. Yeah, so until we do that, one strategy that we're exploring is around ceding control and ceding the mic, which ironically I'm holding. So we just published a series that I really love, edited by our migration editor, Eric Rady, but written by people in migration situations. So people from different countries different circumstances, some refugees, some economic migrants, some in poverty, some not, around different aspects of the global migration system and why it's broken. And what I love about the series is it's not just, first-person essays, here's my life, here's my story. It's people who are deep experts on these systems because they live through them, explaining, what's not working with these systems. So it's not just kind of a token, hey, tell us about your lives. It's recognizing the expertise that comes, that exists in people living through these situations. So when someone who grew up in a refugee camp tells you why the UN refugee resettlement system is broken, he can speak about it just as well as any academic, any policy advisor, any think tank person, because he knows that system inside and out. And so it's kind of recognizing that expertise and seeding our platforms for people to reach the audiences that we've been able to accumulate with their own words and their own expertise, I think is one, start of a way to get there.
So basically we need to lobby the newspapers we read to use more of those expertise.
Yeah.
Maybe. Click more consciously on headlines, pay for different content. I mean, you can do that if you're in a certain bubble. But beyond that...
we have to acknowledge it's hard work. It takes more time. It's a lot easier to hire someone you already know, who's in your newsroom in London and Berlin and in Paris, and have them write something real quick than building these networks that we generally don't have in newsrooms, working across cultures, sometimes working across languages. It takes time, it takes money, which is something that we know we don't really have in journalism, but it's worth it.
It's worth it, that's it, it's worth it. It actually leads to better stories in the end. And I feel like this is always an aspect that is omitted. It's okay, now we need to invest into journalists from over there, we need translators, we need this and this. And I'm like, no, in the end, you will have a better story for it, which is why we need to keep doing it.
I love that. That's a beautiful last statement before we open up to the audience, and we have 15 minutes left, I see, because there's someone looking into the papers showing me signs. So, I said before, we are convinced that there are many experts in the room as well. So if you have questions or want to share your thoughts, please do so. There's a mic. Yes, there are two
There's a mic
people.
There. Yeah.
The woman blonde before the person I don't see behind her. Hi, there. That's the second question I have here on my radar.
Kind of share them around the room because it's a tad uncomfortable maybe for people. Or can we pass them around? Thank you for your talk. I think.
Can you maybe? You don't need to give your name if you are uncomfortable, but maybe a word on your background.
I'm a journalist with a focus on misogyny and anti-feminism.
Thank you.
To work on online radicalization. And my question is, as you all pointed out or touched upon, that the struggles of former colonialized countries are systematic struggles. They are based on colonialist and capitalist exploitations. But this is very dry to explain to people in journalist articles because people want, as you mentioned, they want poverty porn. They want sad stories to empathize with. Yet those individual stories are hard. How could one, as a journalist, branch from individual stories that humanize people and the victims of those structural oppressive forces? How can one reach out and point out those fates, those sufferings are based and rooted in structural exploitation and discrimination, and still make it appealing to an audience? Because, as you mentioned it, the end of poverty porn would be the end of would be rooted in the end of systemic racism. And I think as journalists or activists, we need to point out that those struggles are systematic, because otherwise they won't really be yeah, otherwise they won't end, and they can only end via like community building and solidaric fights and everything. And this needs also be like a point of, I think, progressive journalism, isn't it?
Yes, definitely, definitely. So for me personal, when I write someone's story, like an individual story, I always add a structural point to it. Like this is my personal motto, my personal rule. I will never write a story where there's not, if there's a systemic issue behind it, where it's not mentioned at one part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's the context, right? Like, look, you're writing a story about something going on in Haiti, and typically you'll have the context paragraph. Haiti has not had a government for however years now. After the assassination of blah blah blah, you always have that paragraph. Well, that paragraph should include Haiti was forced to pay billions of dollars in reparations to former slave owners and colonial powers because why? That can literally be a sentence in the context setting of articles. It's just about what you choose to prioritize. And any editor who tells you we don't have space for that in the story is just not prioritizing the right things. Like, you can cut something else. Also in digital, we have space. So yeah, it's just a matter of making it a systematic, literally thing that you acknowledge.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nicholas. I'm from Paris. I'm a teacher. I am going to talk to you about dirty things. But it's safe for Republica. When I read poverty porn, I was thinking of something you might have just started to talk about, which is click porn. For example, I was thinking about the responsibilities of the platforms, social media platforms. I'm thinking, for example, of Mr. Beast, who is a very well-known YouTuber, who is paying for the surgery of cataract, giving sight to people, to 1,000 people for views. This is dirty. This is, to me, another type of poverty porn, because it is very condescending. It is not even about racism and colonialism. It's just about, I have wealth. That's the topic of Republica this year. So I have money. I can cure you. I can feed you. This is porn. This is dirty.
But you'll have to pay for it with your dignity. Yeah, no, you're spot on.
Yeah, also, I mean, we only touched upon certain issues. For me, for example, if you're opening up that field, there's also a social component in it, like using people without, mainly who don't have a standard of education sometimes, mainly in TV shows, putting them in front of the camera for the entertainment of others. Often enough, including children who don't have a say in it, which I think is, personally, that's my very personal opinion, I think that shouldn't be allowed. I think there should be a right of a child to his own picture. I think that's very difficult, but the field is very broad. I think you would need more discussions on it, looking at very different aspects of it, because there are too many forms of poverty porn, unfortunately, because it seems like humankind, is liking to see the suffering of the others.
That's dark. But your point brings up something actually that we talked about in prep conversations that we didn't bring up. There's some really perverse incentives in that kind of attention economy. So you can see this influencer or this nonprofit that's trying to raise funds or whatever is exploiting the story of that person in a poverty situation or in a crisis situation, and at the same time, so what you want to do as much as possible is really allow for the agency of the person whose story is being told. But because those perverse incentives exist, and the people whose stories are being told, very much aware of them, they're not stupid, and it creates weird incentives for them to, and I don't have an answer to this, but for them to, in a way, kind of monetize their own story to get, to whatever they need. So I mentioned Cambodia earlier. It's where I started my career. Was my first job in university. After university was reporting for a national newspaper of Cambodia. So I was writing it was an English language paper, but we were living in Cambodia, writing for an audience living in Cambodia. And I saw that where there's a certain kind of stories that Cambodians themselves had come to understand that foreign reporters that came in writing for foreign media wanted, and that nonprofits wanted for their own, marketing and their own fundraising. And so they served up the stories that they knew were expected, and so it just creates these like really weird incentives, and in a way they're taking the power back. They're screwing with you, but it just makes for like, where is the truth anymore? And I don't know. I see you nodding. Please share.
Yeah. I feel like it creates like some sort of industry where, and the problem is it also adds to that whole idea of the cycle of dependency, because people also learn, yep, this is where I'm going to get the money from if I do this kind of story. So let's just, this whole cycle of giving from the north, from the global north, people from the global south taking, is just reinforced by this whole thing.
Yeah. I see the question. I come from the documentary film field. I run a film festival. I have to give out one film tip, at least, or two, on exactly that topic. We showed in the past 2 outstanding films. One is called Stop Filming Us, and the answer on that film is called Stop Filming Us But Listen. The first one is by a Dutch filmmaker, really great. He was for NGOs in Congo doing this NGO type of films. And then he started to talk to young journalists there, and he made a film about how they want to be seen from his perspective. And then and it's his perspective and his artistic documentary journalistic freedom in a way. And then those young journalists answered with their own documentary on it, for which he gave them all his material. And I can encourage anyone to watch those 2 films, because for me they were very interesting and enlightening. You will find both of them online. The next questions. Sorry, film tips.
Hello, thank you for the film tip. I'm Nicholas. I'm covering as a journalist since 15 years poverty in Germany, and I have actually 2 questions, because this topic actually is related to my former or now business life. First topic would be partnerships. So I work and try to find solutions for homeless people in Germany, especially from Hamburg, and we're doing films and photos and texts about it. I was wondering if there's a definition for you. Where is the thin line? Where's the red line? You said something like this. You mentioned it. We are trying to do it with agreements, written agreements and stuff. We are doing some kind of partnerships, so they agree and they like it usually. So they can refuse it later on and say, I don't want to be part on your website or social media anymore. So this is, for me, the case what we're doing. The second topic would be constructive journalism or solutions journalism. I am trying to do more than constructive journalism, actually, because I think it's not enough for these problems in the world that we have, not only poverty. So I am a journalist and activist, and I want to give you 2 examples of journalists and activists. For example, the founder of Greenpeace is an activist, and he was a journalist. And for example, here in Germany, Rupert Neudeck, he's not alive anymore. He founded in 1979 the Boat People Action. It's called, I can't remember. It's Cap Anamur. It's a very famous NGO actually. So he was a journalist for Spiegel here in Germany, and at the same time actually he was an activist. So the second question would be, do you think it's enough to be a journalist in these times? Do you think it's enough to be doing constructive journalism, or should journalists do more for this at the moment in this world? Thank you.
As we have only 5 minutes, I really like those two questions because they're beautiful closing questions and very difficult ones. A quick thought from my side, an observation from an outsider. For the first part of the question, I think that with really informed consent and giving the people a voice in what you're doing with their story and them knowing what's happening with that and for which purpose it's used, it's a first important step. And then I will give the mic first to
just
Celia.
allowing them to refuse it later on. That I feel like is very important.
Yeah, true. Which is beautiful if it works. I was talking to many documentary filmmakers who said in a capitalist world where the film is out once, it's really hard to take it back because of structural problems. But any thoughts from you too on those two questions and a closing thought that you would like to share?
Well, I mean, on the activism bit, because I'm here representing an organization, and I think my organization has a clear stance on that we do journalism and not activism. And I understand both sides of that perspective. The challenge with, I think, being activists at the same time that you're journalists is it's hard enough to get people to trust that what we're telling, the stories we're sharing. And so if you come in with a kind of skin in the game as, defending a particular side, a particular position, makes it really hard, even if your work is fact-based and accurate, to be taken seriously, especially in the kind of anti-journalist world that we live in. But that said, I personally don't, believe in kind of this idea of absolute neutrality or absolute objectivity. I don't know what that is. But that's just me. I don't want to speak for the organization because honestly, our editor-in-chief should be here to answer that question and not me. Yeah, you take it, and then I do have a final thought.
Same to everything, basically. I mean, as you just mentioned, being non-white, for example, and covering my topics, for many, many people out there, it always makes me an activist. It doesn't matter if I work as a journalist, if I do everything correctly, people will just be like, of course, she's covering racism, she's super biased, this is an activist, this is not a journalist. So for me, it doesn't really matter what I do. Yeah. Literally the color of my skin, and it's just enough for people to call me an activist.
Well, somehow the white guy's perspective is supposed to be a default,
of course, super
neutral, objective. Yeah.
Quick last thoughts. We have, I think, 1 minute left, so you have to speak very fast.
Well, just one thing that came to mind when we were talking earlier about these kind of perverse incentives, and I'm going to say something a bit more radical than I'm used to saying, but whatever, I'll say it for me. As long as we have a global economy and a global system where some people's livelihoods depends on the stories that are told about them and on other people opening up their wallet and paying them attention, this is going to continue to be an issue, and there's going to continue to be these imbalances and these perverse incentives in storytelling. And so as much as we can build a fairer world, we'll tell better stories.
I agree.
Beautifully. We have an agreement at the end. I like that. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. I hope you could take something away from our conversation and we could give you some ideas. And I personally hope to see you at not just at the next Republica, but also at the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin in October. Thank you so much.
Thank you.